Hello. For this edition of Dog Talks, we're out here in the garden because we'd like to use a little bit of a garden analogy at one point. This is an episode about faith, and particularly I have something to say about weak faith and dealing with those of weak faith. Say hello, Mowgli, Zazu. You guys want to get down and sniff around the garden? Why don't you go ahead and I'll take care of this while you do that, okay? Go ahead. Go get down. All right. Let me tell you a bit of a story here to illustrate my point for this little episode. I once had a student in a religion course in an assignment we did where I asked them to write an epistle, write a letter. They could write it to someone as an individual, or they could write it to a church, like the letters of the New Testament. And I had someone turn in a letter that was scolding a congregation for lack of church attendance. Had done the math on how many members there were at church and how many were actually in attendance on any given Sunday. And then if you allowed for those who were away at college or in military service, and you allowed for those who were perhaps traveling and attending another congregation that day, or allowed for those who were perhaps on rotating work shift and could not come that Sunday or were ill. Still, there were 600 members who were just skipping church that day, according to this letter. And then the letter went on to call that kind of behavior goddamn sin, and if those persons did not repent, they should not expect God would let them into heaven one day. I gave a rather poor score to the letter in our project. It was well written, but the attitude, the tone of the whole thing was not good at all. The student came rushing to my office because she had never gotten that low of a score on anything she'd ever written in the past, and she was very upset. And I said, well, the tone of the letter was such that you're just going to scare people more away from church than bring anyone back. And she said, but this is, I modeled it after a letter that our pastor at our church sent out in a newsletter to the whole congregation, and everybody said it was a great letter. And I kind of overlooked the plagiarism part of that. I was sad that everybody, or a lot of the regular members of the congregation and the pastor of the congregation, would think that was a great approach. And we talked a lot that day, the student and I, and in an ongoing way, because we actually became closer as a result of that experience, about how we deal with those where faith is weak. Not making assumptions, not bullying, but trying to nurture and bring those persons back toward a stronger and more active life of faith. We referenced the passage concerning Jesus that says, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. I pulled a few of my little reed-type plants here from the garden. How frail and gentle they are. They can be easily bent, broken, snapped. And faith can be that way sometimes. And we don't want to snap it further or trample it underfoot. We don't want to make assumptions about the reasons why people may not be in church on a given Sunday. In my experience as a pastor, I had a couple who had not been to church for a number of years when I arrived at that congregation and was installed as the pastor, and I went and made the rounds of members, and as I met them, I found out that they had grown weary of coming to church after they lost a child to sudden infant death syndrome. And every time they came to church in the weeks, the months, the years after that, always everyone would be asking them, how are you? And how are you doing with the death of your child? And it got so overwhelming for them, they started to stay away. Wasn't that they had lost their faith, but that they had a struggle with that particular burden of faith. Or I knew another individual who she and her husband were not coming to church they were regulars, and then they weren't there for several weeks in a row, and I went to visit with them and found out that someone had said something that offended the wife in this couple, that she was hurt, she felt judged, and she just couldn't bring herself to come back to church. Now, the whole thing was a misunderstanding, but to her it was very real. What she perceived was very real. Her faith was wounded. Her trust in her fellow members was wounded. So before we make assumptions about why someone may or may not be at church, we should really be careful and reach out to them the way we would deal with gentle, tender plants in the garden that may be fragile and may be in need of nurture and careful tending in order to bring them back to a stronger form of life. So one of the points in this lesson about faith is that weak faith is still saving faith. And when we think of weak faith, I'd also like us to think in terms of how do we approach those whose faith may be weak? How do we deal with those in ministry who are struggling? Not in a bullying way, not in a pushy or demanding way, because that may have the opposite effect of what we hope for. We want faith to be strengthened, faith to be nourished, faith to grow strong, and eventually flower more and more as the life of faith goes on. Thank you for attending this episode of Dog Talks. Dogs, would you like to come for a treat? Come back, it's treat time, dogs. Come here. Mowgli, where are you? Come here, Zazu. Let's have a treat. My dogs have very weak faith and often need to be nourished and nurtured, and I think I've lost one of them while I've sat here in the garden. I best go find him now. Thank you. Goodbye.